Welcome to the Grow Your Law Firm podcast, brought to you by Pilma. This podcast helps lead lawyers to more growth, profit, and freedom. Here is your legal marketing expert and host, Ken Hardison.
Well, hello, everyone. This is Ken Hardison, and welcome to another episode of Grow Your Law Firm. And today we have the pleasure of having Dave Maxfield, who is an attorney, practicing attorney out of Columbia, South Carolina. And he's also an adjunct professor at the University of South Carolina School of Law. He's also author of an ABA bestseller, and I'm going to read it so I don't get it wrong. The Lean Law Firm, Run Your Firm Like the World's Most Profitable and Efficient Business. And he also is the co-host of a podcast himself called the Lean Law Firm Podcast. So welcome.
Hey, thanks, Ken. Thanks for having me. And, it's funny. I appreciate you reading the book to make sure you got it right. We have at the University of South Carolina a really good president who the other night in a commencement address, I think, used the word California instead of Carolina, which made a lot of people unhappy, and he's taken some heat for it. But so it's important to get things right. Yeah.
So tell us, I just covered the very minimal. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got into writing this book, the whole deal. Professor, adjunct professor, and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. Well, I have kind of an interesting backstory that maybe is sort of familiar. I went to law school. I think I went 91 to 94, graduated and walked out with a degree, which, as we talked about a minute ago, maybe doesn't, it's a big achievement, but it's not, it's kind of a starting point rather than an ending point. And, I was one of those guys that walked out and I could confidently stride up to an employer and say, I'm in the top 65% of the class. So, why don't you give me a job? And that didn't work out so well with the big law firm. So as a result, I never kind of got this opportunity to be in like a firm that was managed for me from a business standpoint, and was always started out with a great, smart, kind of semi-country lawyer who had all these great sayings, which I'll get to in a minute. But he taught me a lot about business, but then I kind of ran into a place where I had to learn more on my own. And, that's the thing they don't teach us in law school, Ken. They don't teach us anything about really how to run a law firm, how to run a business. Although, a whole lot of us, maybe the majority are going to be in small firms or solos. And so, we're kind of going out into the world sometimes ill-equipped for what the world's got in store for us.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. That's one of the reasons I started Pilma. For lawyers is to help them with that thing. That's
Absolutely,
why I'm doing this podcast. While I'm doing this podcast too, I want to help.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to be a lean law firm?
Well, that's kind of what it took me a little while to figure out. And where the word lean comes from is manufacturing. You think of companies like Toyota, which, after World War II kind of, nobody ever heard of them. Nobody ever heard of them in the 50s and the 60s. You kind of start to hear about them. And now they're, maybe the dominant car maker in the world. And how did they get there? And the way they did that was by implementing their principle was a guy named Taiichi Ohno called lean, which is the elimination of waste, which the Japanese called mura, and then sort of the optimization of every process. It's a way of sort of looking at things, not so much like, here's, we have this line over here that's building this, and then we're doing wheels over here, but to look at the whole thing as one big system and then figure out what's slowing that system down so that every part of it can move faster and that the system as a whole can be profitable. And kind of how I came to that, to answer your question, is, when I kind of got to the sticking point of my own business part of my practice and said, well, how do I want to grow? You help people grow, and like, how do you do that? I started looking back, and this was a while ago before there were podcasts, but for books, from people who publish law books, and for sort of like, well, how do you run a practice exactly? And as you know, there wasn't a whole lot out there. Right? There wasn't much. I remember a law book. There was a book I found that was written in 1955 called Establishing a Law Practice. And it had like this model of what a lawyer's day should look like. It was like, you'd roll into the office like at 10, you'd answer some phone calls, you'd dictate some stuff, you'd go to lunch at noon, probably have 2 martinis, come back at 2, and do a few more things and go home. And then you know, it was kind of like this, it kind of looked like the TV show Hazel. You know, you'd go home in this big car to this young wife in this big house, and, you know, she'd bring you another martini. But that's not the reality of practice, you know, as we know it in the 90s and the 2000s. I mean, it's really different. So those kinds of books weren't much help. And that's where I started to turn to people like, Taiichi Ono, Eliyahu Goldratt, who's an Israeli physicist who wrote a book called The Goal that you're probably familiar with. One of the books in your background right there called Built to Sell, which is a great book for lawyers to read too. Things in short that are outside the legal profession, by people who have been running businesses in smart, lean ways since the beginning of the 20th century. Like, you know, and that's where I started to find some of these things. So I hope that answers.
Yeah, I read some of those lean books, and because they're really big in scaling up program and mastering the Rockefeller habits. And I don't remember everything because I read too much, but I do remember this, that they a lot of they would go in the mornings, and everybody would actually do cleaning, would do like janitorial work in the morning before they actually went to their jobs. They would do. And I thought that was the coolest thing I'd ever heard.
Oh yeah, they at Toyota, you know, they have things like where when they would find a defect, like in a car that was coming along the line, no matter how low ranking you were, you know, just like no matter how high ranking you were, you might be cleaning up things so that there wasn't, you know, an accident waiting to happen on the production floor. As low as you were, you could stop the entire production line to address that mistake so that you didn't have this, you know, this waste creeping through the process that inevitably you'd have to address later. And of course, you know, lawyers know all about that. You know, we get something wrong and we got to redo it. You can't charge anybody for that. And it usually takes 5 times as much time to fix it as it would have to get it right, you know, get it right in the first place. So it's a good example.
So when people think of lean, you know, that's the first thing I thought about was, well, this is all about just cutting costs here and cutting, you know, a nickel here and a dime there and counting your paper clips and things like that. But lean's a lot more than that, isn't it?
It's a lot more than that. You know, we don't, surprisingly, I spend very little time counting paper clips these days. You know, they mainly are things to destroy scanners, you know, in the 21st century. But it, you know, very little about it is about actually cost cutting. It kind of has that, you know, you get the name lean and you're like, oh, that's about cutting costs. Almost none of it's about that. It's usually about looking at things like a system, thinking about how that system should work, and then looking at what you're really trying to get rid of are the things that are slowing that down. Like if I look at you know, you always hear this saying, a chain's only as strong as its weakest link. If I'm in a production environment and I have 4 machines and machine A can put to, you know, through 50 units an hour, and machine B 100 units, and machine C, you know, 10 units, and machine D 80 units, all my efforts need to be addressed on machine C, because nothing's ever going to go past 10 units, and all you're going to get is a bottleneck behind it. And so lawyers have to really, you know, we think we're so special, but really we're producing things. You know, we got people come in with problems, we're figuring out what the answer to that problem is. We're usually doing some kind of paperwork, but there is like a client comes in with the problem on the left, they go through a process and they come out with a solution on the right. And it's what happens in between those things that usually dictates like our profitability more than anything else.
Yeah, you know, I was talking to a lawyer yesterday, and we were talking about bottlenecks, and like, you know, I deal a lot with PI lawyers, but we do it all. I mean, you know, I've done every kind of practice in the world except bankruptcy. Plaintiff's bankruptcy. I've done the debtor, you know, I've been after them before, but over my long career, which we don't want to go there, it's 40 years now since I got my bar license, so I'm old as dirt. But like the 2 big bottlenecks that I always see with law firms and PI practices is when somebody reaches MMI, maximum medical improvement,
right,
and then getting a demand out, and then and then once they get it settled, then getting it dispersed because of all the conglomerate, all the damn red tape with the liens, with Medicare, Medicaid, the insurance carriers, third-party liens. It's just a nightmare. And
Right.
we were talking about, because people don't realize it, and this is something that you realize evidently very soon, is that if you can press the time it takes to handle a case and you're on a contingency basis,
Right.
which PI lawyers are, then you don't have to hire as many people because you're turning your inventory. It's sort of like, I think about it like Dell computers. That's when they brought in the CFO and changed everything,
Right.
and got it to where, they were getting their money up front. Well, you can't do that with PI work. But the deal is, they were making them as you ordered them,
Right.
and then having them out. And it saved a lot of money, and it saved a lot of labor.
Yep.
And it saved a lot of inventory and cost of inventory. And cases are inventory, the way I look at it. I mean, people say, well, we are a profession, but when you're trying to bump and most law firms have really good margins compared to the general businesses out there in the world.
Right.
But if you're trying to increase if your profit margin is 30%, 30%, you're trying to get it to 40% or whatever it might be, different practices are going to have different margins. But I'll just think that people, it's just what you said. It's not about just cutting the cost. It's about getting more efficient. And that's the key, being more efficient. And that's better client service.
Oh, 100%. And I mean, you're really, oh, I know exactly what you're saying. And you really have nailed it when you're, especially working with PI lawyers. There's probably not, lien lends itself really well to most kinds of law, but where it really shines the most is in a plaintiff's practice, like a PI practice. Mine's a plaintiff's practice on contingency. PI is the best example because, and it's sort of for different reasons than you think it would be. First of all, like, let's address that idea of, sort of, we're making it impersonal somehow by treating it like a business. Because, what your client wants, if you're a PI lawyer, and what PI lawyers advertise for is they want a good result, but they want it fast. They don't want to wait 4 years. Sometimes there are certain constraints built in. You got to get to somebody to MMI, maximum medical improvement, before their case is ready to settle. But there are a lot of things that we create that add time to the overall process. And number one, the clients don't want that. But what lawyers, I think, don't realize, we're so used to thinking in terms of like our hourly rates, PI lawyers less so. But, time, it has this different impact in law firms than we really think it does. Like if I can take a case that I can get from beginning to end in and maybe let's just say I make I as a lawyer make $10,000 on it, and it takes 300 days for me to do that. Okay. Let's say if I can now, and you could do the math and say, well, how much did I make per day on that case? $300 or whatever the number is. If you can cut that time from beginning to end in half, you just doubled your money. And what people don't really ever think of, and maybe humans don't think of, is like, well, we're not going to live forever. Lawyers are like NFL left tackles. We got a certain amount of time. It might be you've had a very long career. I'm 27 years in, and hopefully, God willing, we got a lot longer, but there is a finite amount of time that we have to make the money that we're going to make. And if we can, compress that same money into shorter periods of time, that means we can do more cases and we can handle more, and we make more in each, year that way. And so a huge part, when you look at that PI firm that you just talked about, they got bottlenecks where they get somebody to MMI and they can't control that bottleneck. That is what it is. But then the case sits, and it sits for 30 days and it sits for 60 days. They just added 90 days to something called their cycle time, which based on the example we just gave at 150 days versus 300 days, they're hurting themselves by doing that. If the case settles the same, as it's going to settle. It's the same thing. Other bottleneck, very typical bottleneck in a PI law firm is that finishing. You got liens to deal with, you got checks to write, you got to drag the money out of the insurance company, all these things. So the take home from lien is that if that's what's slowing you down, you put your efforts on that. Not necessarily that you hire fewer people. It's like maybe you hire somebody else who deals with those things specifically to make sure that when that MMI gets hit, you plug in the numbers and that letter goes out the next day. That's how you make more money. That's one of the ways you make more money in a PI firm. And that's the one to go on and on and on here, that's the one we can control, because we go in front of a jury, we don't know what they're going to do. We can't control what the adjuster is going to do. We can influence them. We can influence a jury, but in the end, that's out of our control. What's fully within our control is what happens inside our firm. And you can control whether that employee has got a demand letter locked and loaded and ready to go and doesn't let it sit for 60 days. And that's going to make you more money as a PI lawyer.
Yeah, I used to tell my associates, I said, these cases are not like fine wine. They do not get better with time. They are worth what they are.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of, and time is money.
And clients don't get more like connoisseurs of fine wine, where they get happier and happier the longer they got to wait. They're like people at the table, So
tell me about this income formula.
Well, the income formula is kind of a little bit what we just talked about, which is you talked about a case being in sort of something you have in inventory, right? And so you have, we call that in the book like a case unit. And so and this is almost like too dumb to not be, everybody goes, oh, duh, of course, but we don't really think this way. Your income is determined by the number of units you can get across the finish line in a year times the average value of each one of those. So if you're running a PI firm, let's turn to divorce for a second. Let's say somebody's running a sort of a easy, quickie divorce firm, and they charge everybody $1,000, and they're doing 100 of them a year. So they're bringing in $100,000 a year, just to keep the numbers really simple. There's two ways they can make more money. They can either go up on their prices, which in a competitive business can be very hard to do. Just say, you know what, I'm just going to charge you $2,000. They'll just go up the street, get somebody else. So you can't do that usually. And so the other way you can make more money is by putting more of those units across the finish line every year. So and we call that throughput. So if I could, sort of throughput more units each year across the finish line, if they're still worth the same amount of money, I make more money. And it turns out, so your income formula is just like average unit value times your throughput rate, and you can make that over a year. So that could be $100,000. One way, the easiest way to increase that number is to increase the number of cases. Okay. And the easiest way to do that is by sort of what we just talked about, where we're making every case take less time. We're dropping the cycle time, which is like the amount of time that a case comes into your system, between the day it comes into your system and the day it goes out. If we can take that, and let's say that in this person's hypothetical divorce firm, it's averaging a year, 365 days, and we can make that like 200 days instead, they can do more cases. Okay, because they're all getting done quicker. And so there's more capacity. So that speed increase, let's say now we're getting up to 150 cases a year because we dropped that time down, you're making 150,000 instead. And this is not stuff that like I came out of nowhere with. There's something called Little's Law, which is a guy named John Little, who is a professor at MIT that was the one to sort of mathematically figure out the relationship between inventory, cycle time, and throughput. And so, by dropping that time, like getting back to our PI firm, making that 30 days that it takes to get a demand letter out turn into 10 days, we can do more cases. And assuming they're all worth the same, we make more money.
Right. I mean, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I've read in Scaling Up, it's called the cash flow cycle, and what can you do to compress it, and still not give up quality. That's right. The key. That's the key. You don't still want to do a great job.
Oh yeah.
But and you're right. And then we could get into this price elasticity about how much you can go up, and then look at your conversions. And we won't. That's for another podcast. We won't do that.
There is. We could talk. There's always a limit, and it's always somebody else that gets to control it, like the market or an adjuster or a jury. That's the problem with that. But the cool thing about lean stuff is like when you really get your process, when you think in terms of systems and how to improve those, usually as a byproduct, the quality goes up. So our cases get, for PI lawyers, for example, your cases get worth a little bit more because you're putting them together a little better. They build Ferraris on an assembly line, but they look pretty good, and they work all right. So,
you know, I've often heard, I've read or I've heard that, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
yeah.
What should a law firm be measuring? What do they use? What's the right things to be measuring?
That's a good question. The things that really matter, I think, are really simple things to measure. Like, one of them obviously is that throughput rate. How many cases did we finish this year? How many did we put across the finish line? That's really important. On average, how much is each one worth to us? And we start to, and the reason that that's important is because it's one of the two components of that income formula. So that's really important. But the other part of that that's important is that when we start to look at that, we start to see patterns. Like, let's say you're doing workers' comp, and you're doing PI, and then you have kind of this niche specialty. Like a friend of mine down here named Kenny Berger has kind of like this traumatic brain injury sort of emphasis. And so maybe we can say, as we look at what each case has brought in over the years, there's some pattern where like a certain kind of case or a certain kind of client keeps doing really well for us, like strangely for me as a consumer protection lawyer, maybe not strangely, but in Columbia, South Carolina, where Fort Jackson is, which is this huge training base, man, I mean, if you're in the military down here, people like revere you. So if I have a military plaintiff, lots of times, that can be really good for me because on a jury, I might have 6 veterans, I mean, that's just a good metric. So I start to look at that and go, these veteran cases are really good. Maybe I should be looking for more of those. And that dictates how I market, once I kind of start to figure that out. So we should be measuring those two things. I look every day at how much money do I got in the bank? It's like looking at your gas gauge. That's something that's kind of like, we all hopefully do that, but I do that. And I have on settled cases, this is good for PI lawyers. I have something called a pipeline where once case is settled, but I don't have the money yet, I'm always tracking that because I want to see what I've got coming in. And it's really easy to track these things. Like we have a spreadsheet at leanlawfirmbook.com that lets you do that. I'm working on a sort of a more improved one. But I mean, it's just a matter of like, okay, this case came in on this day. So it was this kind of case. It's settled on this day. The money is going to be this. And then I just move that money over to a different column when it actually comes in. And I see, what am I making in the course of a year? So it's really a handful of things that you have to measure. Average unit value, throughput rate, cycle time, and kind of the type of case it was for your future marketing efforts. I mean, you measure those 4 or 5 things, and that's like 90% of what you really need to know.
When I talk to lawyers, I tell them, I say, go back and look at the last 12, 18, 2 years and see what the top 20% of your fees came from.
Yeah.
And look at these cases. What type of cases were they? Yeah. What was the demographic of the person? I mean, you're doing the right things, Dave. I mean, that's the first things I'm telling them. But I said, because usually what you find, and I don't know if you find it in the consumer law business, but 80% of your fees will come from 20% of your cases.
Yeah,
if it don't, you probably got a problem.
That's it. That's exactly right. I mean, I'm sure talking to people, I can see by the books behind you, is it the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule, and that the more you look at your own numbers, and it's such an easy thing to keep your own numbers, you just do it on a Google spreadsheet. It can be that simple, but you're going to realize exactly what you're saying, Ken, which is like, my best clients sort of all kind of are the same person over and over again, and just like a variant of that person. So we got to go find more of those people.
Well, who's your ideal client, man? That's what you want.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's great advice.
So why is it important that law firm systems be visual?
Well, a whole lot of our understanding as humans is visually biased. Like, we communicate, verbally, we understand things auditorily. Some of us are, we have different learning styles, but most of us are predominantly visual. And that's because a lot of our nerves, and I'm probably getting the science all wrong, but we have a lot a lot of our processing power is dedicated to understanding things that we see visually. We're really biased that way.
I am. I know I am.
Yeah, I think it's probably even, especially with male lawyers, I think it's even more. I mean, I think there's like our visual bias is even higher. Just something I've observed over time. And so, one of the things that's lawyers traditionally do is like we'll have all these lists of things, or you think about how we communicate in like pleadings and discovery, and that has translated sometimes into a couple of things that aren't helpful, which is like when we're trying to run our firm as a system, we have like a list of clients and we kind of have a lot of things in our head. And we don't always have like a really good way, even like good case management systems are really kind of like sometimes digital versions of like the old paper that we used to use to do the same thing. Here's all your clients, in a list, in a linear list, and here's all your contacts from your Rolodex in sort of this list. And the problem is that doesn't really tell us what's going on in our firm as a system. It's just lists of things. And so if you look in almost any modern factory, like Toyota was, big into these really early, they have something called a Kanban board, which is like a huge digital board that everybody on the factory floor can see in real time at the same time. And it tells them like where units in the system are. So I could look up there and say, okay, well, here's where this order is, in a factory. And I could also go up there and see where things are piling up. So I can see a bottleneck really easily. Well, that's great when you're on the floor of some giant factory and everybody can look up and see this big board, but it's not easy in a law firm where we're all, we might be in little different offices. These days we might all be, remote, or, anywhere in line at the Shell station. So what we try to do is to take the idea that you have things coming in on the left and going out on the right. Like I have this new case. I have a case for Ken Hardison, and this is what kind of case it is. And it's going to go through my process and it's going to come out the other side at some point. But I need to see where at any time it is within my process. A Kanban board is like a series of columns. And just picture, to make it real easy, like a big poster board or a whiteboard with columns, and each case is like an index card that's stuck to it. And I can move that as it goes through my system. And with programs like Trello or Rindle, or even now built into some case management systems, we can take all our matters or our clients or, again, what I call our case units, and we can move those things. We can see where they are in real time all the time. And everybody in our office can look on that same, web-based product and see where things are at once. So instead of me calling, one of my paralegals and going, hey, Janelle, where is this? What's happening in this case? When she gets that call from that client, she can say, oh, your case is in discovery right now. This is what that means. And here's where you are, in the overall process. We don't even have to talk about it within the firm because we all know just by looking at the same board. So it's a great way to keep everybody on the same page without having to have everybody constantly meeting or digging down into the weeds of linear lists.
Well, I retired from practicing about 10 years ago, but one thing I did, and I want your advice on how I can make it better, or people out there, because you probably could illuminate me. So what I did was I do a case status, and I had different case statuses, and once they hit a certain point, they got a different code, and then I could run reports. I could run it by the attorney, I could run it by the paralegal, I could run it by the type of case, I could run it, by the case status, but I could run a lot of combinations, and I could sit there and I could see, and I could run it by time with some of the benchmarks, and it really gave me a quick. Although now some of our members at PILMA are using dashboards and they're seeing like real-time stuff. I got some lawyers now that they'll have like 5 big computer screens on their desk, man, and they're looking at all this stuff all the time. It looks like they're playing the stock market.
It does look
I mean, they're watching intakes, they're watching conversions,
and
they're watching, they're just seeing everything. The money coming in, how many cases are out there that haven't been dispersed. I mean, all this stuff that we talked about.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's some software called Moz, but I'm not sure if that's what it's called, MOZ.
I've heard of that too. Yeah, there is something like that. There are a lot of choices with those sorts of things, but what they're doing is exactly what, and the way you're coaching is exactly, you were ahead of your time, because you're realizing that just the movement of things itself can trigger certain other things, instead of me having to go, oh, well, where is this thing? Number one, ask the question, where is it? Two, ask the question, well, what do we do? Because you can automate all of those things.
Right.
So, and that's what they're doing. Your guys in your organization are running things like a business, because that's what y'all do and what you teach people to do. And that's what dashboards do. It gives us that visual feedback so we can see real time where things are. And if that lawyer's partners in Little Rock, Arkansas, getting ready to get on a plane, he can look at his phone and see where things are too. And we're keeping an eye on the things that really matter that way. So, and Kanban boards are sort of just one. It kind of comes from manufacturing. It sort of comes from something called agile software programming. It's just the way that really smart people have figured out there's a lot better way to do this than talking about it,
Right. Yeah. Man, this has been great. So what are the big take-home lessons that that our listeners short to take home with us? 3 big takeaways that you say we cover today.
Well, keep listening to Ken's podcast is number one. Read all the books on Ken's shelf, because he's got like some of the greatest book choices. But from my perspective, I think the big shift is to think about your firm as a closed system. People with problems or some kind of legal problem comes in on one side, whatever that is for you. You're going to put those people through some kind of process, and out the other side is going to come money. It's good, and a solution, kind of a completed product. And you take that money and you put it back into getting more raw material, in the form of those clients. You put some of it into improving your system, and you put the rest of it in your pocket. I mean, that is in a nutshell what we do as lawyers, if you want to boil it down to like really simple business terms. So number one would be to start thinking about your firm as a practice. I mean, as a system, rather than just like, I'm a lawyer and I'm an artist and this is what I come in and do, and it's all these different things and it's too complicated for anybody to possibly understand. No, it's really not. It's like and so to think of things that way, make that mental shift, and then get your hands on the numbers that matter for the success of that system, which is, again, is going to be, throughput, how many are coming through that system, what's it producing in terms of income out of that system, how long are things staying in that system, and when we go back and get raw material, what's the good stuff? What are we looking for? Where do we look? That's the sort of the second thing. One thing I should mention, and this may be getting in the weeds too far, but when you do think about what a case unit is, I have a lot of cases where I have like Ken Hardison versus 4 other defendants. And I always tell people to track those things as individual units, because they can all settle, all different things can happen with each one of those. Maybe defendant A says, I'll see you in hell. We're never going to settle this case, so you got a trial. Maybe defendant 2 gets out on summary judgment. Maybe defendant 3 pays you in week 1, and maybe defendant 4, something in the middle of those things happen. So we always break them up, and almost no case management system will let you do that. So you have to kind of do that yourself. So that would be, the big things though.
That's ingenious. That's ingenious. I never thought about that.
It's the only way to like track it that really sort of gives you true data. And something I teach this at the University of South Carolina at the law school. They let me teach this as a class, which, again, they didn't see my grades, I guess, when I was there, which is good. But one of the things that my students realized in that class was they had a sort of a mock firm that had really different practice areas. They were doing like, I think their mock firm was like, they did prenuptials, but then they did like sort of complicated custody litigation and stuff like that. Well, you didn't really want to lump those two things, those practice areas together for your tracking your time, like how long is the cycle time? Because one was going to throw off the other because they were so different. So now I'm starting to say, you should really track those separately too, so that you know what a good cycle time is for a prenuptial, which would be really short, and what a good cycle time would be in a custody case, which would be much longer. So number two would be to track the metrics that matter for you. And then I guess number three would be, try to remember that we can enjoy this too sometimes. It's
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think the more systematized you are and you run it more like a business, I think that's when you really start creating. I call it freedom.
Oh yeah.
To where you can, I had a couple aha moments, or whatever in my life, and one of them was when I read Michael Gerber's E-Myth back in 1996.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's how long that book's been around. It was 97 or 96. I read that book.
Wow.
And told you I'm old as dirt. So,
no, but that's impressive, because you were way, way ahead of the curve. That book only kind of gotten its props lately.
Yeah. Well, I knew there was a better way. I used to, I'm ashamed to say it, but I was one of those lawyers that worked 80 hours a week before I figured it out. And
yeah.
I say that's why I have these bags underneath my eyes and these wrinkles over my head was that first 14 years.
Hey, you managed to hang onto the hair pretty good. That's not the other part of that. Yeah.
Those first 14 years, I did it everything wrong a man could do to practice law. I made good money, but I killed myself doing it.
That is absolutely possible. And the cool thing is, and and what you're getting to, I think you were getting ready to say about the E-Myth is like, when you get all this other stuff out of the way, it does kind of open up a certain kind of freedom. Yeah. And that's kind of why these people get in there and clean up the factory floor in the morning at Toyota. That's kind of why they don't let Mountain Dew bottles roll around on the decks of carriers that F-18s land on. You really, if you could keep things sort of like to the essentials and keep the stuff that doesn't matter out of the way, it lets you do your job and lets you do it better with a lot less sort of mental stuff rolling around inside your head too. And I mean, this is the one thing I always tell people, and you probably have said this 100 times, is like, you and me do kind of the same thing in that we try to help people and coach people, whether it's through writing or coaching or both. And, I think people get out there sometimes and try to say, or sell, if you just do this, everything will be perfect and easy all the time. If it were really, it's not like that. It's still challenging. And there's
that's just like everybody wants to know what the secret is to get more cases. Everybody thinks there's no silver bullet. Just like there's no silver bullet in it is. If it was real easy, everybody would be really successful and very happy.
Yeah. But treat it like an experiment. That's the thing. It's like, as you learned over time, you could have had another 20 years of having the same year over and over again, where you did the same stuff that you realize now is not the right thing. Or you could, like you did, learn from it each year until you got to a place where you're like, I know there's a better way, and maybe there's no perfect way, but there's always better, and I'm going to keep experimenting till I find it. And that's what makes it fun, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know you said something about a website. I want to make sure our listeners and viewers get that in case they want to go and check it out.
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, there's a couple places. So you can get the book, The Lean Law Firm, on Amazon. You can get it. We had it done in Audible too, with a guy who's just a great, like, sort of character, voice actor. And what I didn't mention about the book is it's like kind of it's sort of a novel in a way, and that there's a story that goes in there with, if you like graphic novels, or, what we used to call comic books back in the day. There's a lot of comic book panels in the book too, to kind of make it a little bit more accessible and fun. So you can pick that up on Amazon, or you can get it through the ABA's website, or you can go to leanlawfirmbook.com and get it there. And I'm actually in the process right now of putting together an online program too, that's kind of a 5-part path to lean profitability. We all got to do these things these days, but yeah. I've done a lot of coaching lately for some law firms that they found helpful. So I'm like, well, maybe I should put something together. So I'm doing that now too. So hopefully that'll be available.
If somebody wants to contact you about coaching, how do they get up with you?
Yeah. Easiest way is on my firm email, which would be just Dave, DAVE at consumerlawsc, like South Carolina.com.
All right. Good deal, man. Well, listen, I enjoyed it. As always, I learn something every time I do one of these podcasts, and you taught me something today. So For that, I appreciate it. And to our listeners, until next time, this is Ken Hardison, dedicated to your success.
You have been listening to the Grow Your Law Firm podcast, the podcast that leads lawyers to more growth, profit, and freedom. Go to growyourlawfirm.com to find more ways to market and manage your law firm. Please leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to your podcasts.